So before we get started with historic globalization comes to China, it's always important to know, to what extent, how am I going to be tested on this? Looking at the multiple choice part of the midterm, there will be some multiple choice questions about China, but I'm also looking at the essay. And if we end up giving you an essay on the midterm that explores that strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must theme that we've been talking about, I think you'd agree that here in China you see that being played out. That unfortunately for the Chinese, they are seen as the weak and they do suffer. And the British and the Japanese and the Russians, the Germans, the French are seen as the strong, and because of that, they do what they want. I do think that what you've done today, if you end up writing an essay on that topic, the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must, you could write the entire essay based on China. So hopefully you can see some overlap, right? So I want to make sure you leave here today with some solid notes. So that's why I'm getting you to share your document with me, just so that I can take a peek at it. But we're also going to, for the most possibility, the best that we can do here, under these circumstances, we're going to have a discussion where you kind of share with each other the evidence that you found. So in order to really propel your essay, your A2, up to an E status, it's nice to have insightful evidence. Evidence that is sophisticatedly linked to arguments. So we have the arguments already made for you. Now we need to find evidence that continues that argument. So the first argument we're looking at is the 19th century. When 19th century globalization came to China, it proved to be humiliating for China. So let's explore that one first. And while we explore it, if something's mentioned that you don't have in your document, by all means, add it to your document. So, what's some evidence? Yes?
19th century globalization became humiliating for China because other countries had stuff they want to start trading, but China didn't want to start trading, and then they had war, and then they got defeated and they were humiliated, and then they were forced into trading, and they were humiliated by things that happened after taking drugs that they were traded with.
Well, I'm not sure. Yep. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so what China is losing is autonomy. China is losing independence. China is losing self-determination. It's humbling for someone to be able to manipulate and control you. And your example about trade is the perfect example. China doesn't want to trade with the British. The British don't have anything that the Chinese have, or that the Chinese, want. And so the British find something, opium, that the Chinese citizens want, but the Chinese government recognizes this isn't in our best interest. It's going to destroy us at a social level. It's going to be a plague. It's going to be a plight. It's going to create social disease. And yet, the British forced their way into a trading agreement so that the Chinese could buy opium. So you're absolutely right, that's humbling, that's humiliating, to not have control or autonomy, self-determination over your own borders. So I would say that that's humbling or humiliating for China. Do we have any other evidence? Because there's lots, right? There was lots for this one. Yes?
China tried to fight multiple wars for their independence and lost.
Yeah, so China tried to fight multiple wars to defend their territory, but lost these wars. Now, it's humbling for China, it's humiliating for China, because China had an elevated self-image. Because China had an elevated self-image, because they saw themselves as the most powerful entity on the planet, it was humiliating. If the Chinese thought of themselves as a weaker power, then being beaten in battle by others would be what is expected. But because they had a elevated self-image, it's humbling, it's humiliating to be defeated. Now, of those powers, Russia, Britain, France, Germany, and Japan, it was most humbling, most humiliating to be beat by the Japanese. Because the Japanese were also Asian. And the Chinese, if they weren't the most powerful entity on the planet, they better be the most powerful in Asia, in their sphere. But they weren't. Even the Japanese were able to defeat the Chinese in battle. That was humiliating. Why is it humiliating? Well, how do you measure? How do you measure the power of your civilization against mine? One measurement of it is to go to war. So when you lose a battle, when you lose a war, then you've lost that measurement. Now you're seen as less than. And for the Chinese, this was unacceptable because they had an elevated self-image. So, definitely have some solid evidence here. Anything else? Yes?
Because of China's new addiction to opium,
Yep.
they abandoned their children and left them to rot on the streets.
Yeah, it's very graphic, disturbing, and therefore powerful evidence that because of the addiction to opium, it does cause social disease, and a manifestation of that social disease is the neglect and the abandonment of children to the extent that the streets would be littered with their bodies. It's a horrible thing to think of. Your hand was up to you.
Yeah, the English, French, German, and Russians forced China to trade in charge of all import, export, and custom duties.
Yeah, so they have no control over the borders, right? China has no control over its own borders. The British, the French, the Germans, the Russians, they're forcing them to trade. They're forcing them into this globalization, right? So what is the trade? That's globalization. They're being dragged. China's being dragged into globalization. China's saying, we don't want our borders to be open to your interests, to trade with you. We want to be able to control our borders. But they were being forced. And the idea of being forced, if you saw yourself, elevated self-esteem, they saw themselves elevated self-image, they saw themselves as the most powerful place on the earth. Everybody was trying to get to China, but once they got there, then they were able to manipulate China, and that was unexpected for the Chinese. Any other evidence? Yes?
Germans and Russians and the English started taking their territory, and so the Chinese started losing their territory, making everything just more humiliating for them, becoming more bankrupt and desperate.
Definitely humiliating to get something taken from you. It's violating, right? If I break into your house and I rob some of your personal items, you'll feel violated. China feels violated that some of their territory has been taken. And the video that we watched mentioned things like, literally, it's not that it's just like, okay, we're going to take this colony, it's now our territory. It's, we're going to rape and pillage this area. So it's very barbaric. Barbaric exchange of territory. Anything else? Humbling, humiliating. Reasons why the Chinese should be upset. So globalization is coming to them, right? That they're being forced to interconnect with others. And when they're forced to interconnect, China is humiliated to the extent, this is called the century of humiliation for China. That's how big it is. They call it the century of humiliation. Any other big evidence that you have down? Yes?
China was manipulated into signing a treaty that gave Britain complete access to their waterways.
Yeah, so Canada has waterways that are national waterways, and we see that as Canadian territory. Imagine fighting a war against the Americans, and because we lose the war, then the Americans say, you know what, now we get access to your waterways. Again, we're losing sovereignty. We're losing independence. We're losing self-determination. We're losing control over what we believe to be ours. That's humiliating. It's humiliating because we saw ourselves as the strongest civilization, the oldest civilization, the best civilization. There's a reason why China didn't go explore the world looking for a way to get to Europe. They felt no need to get to Europe. Everything they needed was right there in China. Everybody's trying to get to them. So it was humbling and humiliating that they lose their waterways, the sovereignty, the control of them. Any other evidence? Yes?
It also mentioned that this was national humiliation and national disgrace.
Yeah, so just terms like it's a national disgrace, it's national humiliation. So it's not humiliation just for the emperor, it's humiliation for all Chinese. So they all share in the shame, the century of shame. Yes?
The Jin Song and Han gave us substantial tributes outside power.
Sorry, what was that?
The Jin Song and Han gave us substantial tributes outside power.
Yeah, and this is a key point. So what is the tribute? So the government, in essence, had to pay a tribute to outside powers. So the idea of tribute kind of goes back centuries, and not that it originated with the Vikings, but a good example would be that the Vikings would be offshore your settlement, and they'd say, we will pillage you, or you can give us some money and we won't. So a tribute is like extortion. When the mafia says, I'm going to burn your restaurant down, or you give me some money and I'll protect your restaurant. So now we have the major powers of the world demanding tribute from the Chinese. They're plundering, they're robbing them. That's like taking their lunch money. You know, if you give me $15 a day, I won't beat you up. But if you forget one day, I'm going to beat you up. So that's humiliating for the Chinese because, again, they're the oldest civilization on earth. They saw themselves as the most important, and now they have these barbaric empires coming to their borders demanding tribute. If you pay tribute to someone else, you're subject to them. So they have power and authority above you. So you're an inferior power. That's not acceptable to the Chinese. Might be acceptable to lesser people, but the Chinese see themselves as, you know, the center of the world. Anything else for the humiliating part? I like the tribute. I like the controlling the waterways. I like the taking of the colonies. I like the forcing you to buy opium to the extent that children's bodies rot in the streets. This all shows that they're being humiliated. They even tried to resist, right? They tried to resist and they got destroyed. So, some of the tribute, by the way, it wasn't just here's a few yuan or a few dollars. The tribute was, you know, very valuable or invaluable, right? You can't put a price on it. Historical artifacts. You know, here's treasure. You're basically looting treasure from the Chinese. Some of the treasure would be thousands of years old. So we're stealing from their culture. It's not just like we're going to take some money. It's not just an economic tribute. It's like, oh, you know what? That's a really cool vase that's like 4,000 years old. I'm going to take it. And I'm going to, I don't know, use it as a latrine. That's humbling to see that. So next up, body paragraph 2, it was necessary. So I warned you, this wasn't going to be easy. There's no sentence that just says it, but yeah.
The Japanese had to undergo like a massive wave of forced migration.
Yep. So for the Japanese, China's neighbor, obviously separated by, you know, the ocean really, but I'm trying to think of what would the sea be? The Sea of Japan? The North China Sea? Probably subject to controversy what the name is. But anywho, geography aside, The Japanese are forced by the US, by gunboat diplomacy, to globalize. You are open for business. And as they globalize, they become more powerful. Yes?
They mentioned in one of the videos that they should adapt, or like it'll lead to the death of their country, because if they don't, like, because they were already struggling so much by being westernized, so it was hard for them to adapt when they didn't want to.
Yeah,
So
so
it was necessary for them.
19th century globalization was necessary for China. So the video said, quote, I think it was Mark Twain that said, adapt or die. So China had to adapt or die. So what would the death of China look like? Well, when we study the scramble for Africa, we'll see that Africa is carved up into many colonies. China will have smaller spheres of influence, but China as an entity remains. China is not dissected to the point that it ceases to exist. So it was necessary, because now that China is connected in the global village, because of globalization, that they can't practice isolationism anymore. They are now connected. So they need to adapt or cease to exist. So you could argue that the 19th century humiliation was necessary because it ends up teaching them some early lessons on what they would need once they become even more connected in order to survive. And some of those lessons would include the need to progress beyond traditionalism. That there were some practices in China that were centuries or even thousands of years old. In order to still be relevant in the 19th and 20th century, they needed to rethink their values and traditions. And therefore it was necessary. It was a necessary opportunity for them to reflect on whether traditionalism was still relevant. Can we still practice the same values that we've had for 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 years? They are the oldest civilization, so they have these very traditional ancient values. But now that they're forced to be connected, globalization, with others, can they hang on to these values and still hang on to all of their territory and power? The answer is no. So the 19th century showed them that they needed to be more progressive in order to be relevant. I like that term, relevant. If you want to be relevant, you thought you were the most powerful country in the world. Now if you just want to be relevant, you're going to need to adapt to some of the more progressive ideas. Anything else for the second section? So sometimes when you do research, you may end up finding out that, wow, there's not as much in the second section as the first, and therefore if you're writing an essay on this, you may end up combining the second and third into one paragraph and then having something like a 4-paragraph essay instead of a 5. There's no magic number. We used to teach a 5-paragraph essay. Some students will do 11-paragraph essay. It just depends upon how you can divide your argumentation down. Here, because we have so much for 1 and so little for 2, you may combine 2 and 3 into a 1 paragraph. So let's go to 3. Eventually, China benefited from 19th century globalization. How could you prove that? Yes?
It was the cause of the People's Republic of China.
Yeah, so if you think the People's Republic of China, communism, it was an important goal for China to achieve, then that was only possible because of the suffering of the 19th century. The suffering of the 19th century gives them the catalyst. The catalyst is like a push or a spark, gives them a catalyst to change. So no century of shame, no humbling. They still would practice traditionalism and emperor and all that kind of stuff. But because of the humbling, there's a catalyst for change, and communism is introduced into China. So eventually, China benefited from 19th century globalization, would be an argument furthered by the Chinese communists, because they needed that to unite the people. in a progressive new direction. They needed that humbling, that defeat against the foreign powers to understand that they had to unite and work towards something new. Anything else that we could put for that? Eventually China benefited from the 19th century globalization. Yes?
So wars and revolutions caused them to like industrialize and modernize their military and the country and their education.
Yeah, so the wars and revolution caused them to industrialize and modernize the military, the economy. And if you look at China's military and their economy, they are no longer irrelevant. They are a superpower. China is a superpower. They have nuclear weapons. They have, along with the Indians, the largest standing army in the world. And many see them as the only power that could possibly counter the power of America. And their power is only growing. So how did China become the superpower of the 21st century? Because they're humbled in the 19th century. Because they're humbled in the 19th, they are now a superpower in the 21st, because they needed to modernize and mechanize their military and their economy, and they couldn't do that outside of the global village. China needed to find its place within the global village to become relevant and powerful again. So what is its place in the global village? We all know China is the manufacturing hub of the world. And it's the manufacturing hub of the world because they're in the global village, not because they're outside of it. So they didn't want to be in the global village. They tried to resist globalization in the 19th century, but they're dragged in. Once they're dragged in, they found their niche, and now China is relevant and powerful again. To the extent that China doesn't have to placate the Americans. They don't have to do what America expects of them. China is so powerful that they can say no to America. Canada can't do that. So China has become relevant and powerful not because they resisted globalization. They did it first, but they learned the lesson by resisting, and now they've found their unique niche within globalization. That they are an economic hub for the world, a manufacturing hub, but they use the money from that manufacturing hub of capitalism, right? They use it in a communist sense to try to lift up the standard of living quality of life of the other Chinese people. It's a unique system. Anything else for body paragraph 3? So if I'm trying to prove body paragraph 3, eventually China benefits from this, I might throw in some GDP numbers. I might look at some numbers like, well, China embraces globalization in 1976 when Deng Xiaoping says to get rich is glorious. And then I might say, here's what the GDP of China has done since 1976. This is what it was before when they were trying to stay outside of the global village. It's growing, but it's not growing that well, especially compared to the US and other countries in the global village. But once they find their place in the global village, after Nixon goes and travels to China and opens China up for trade, and Deng Xiaoping takes over from Mao when Mao dies, then the GDP grows at approximately 8% per year since 76. An economic growth rate that has been the marvel of the world. It has outgrown the United States, it's outgrown Canada, and it has done that because they found their niche. They found their place in the global village. So, in the future, you will be writing an essay for me, and it may be on that topic, the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. I think that is answered here. The strong, the British, the French, the Germans, the Japanese, they do what they can, they do what they want. They plunder, they demand tribute, they force them to buy drugs. The weak suffer. We can see bodies in the streets, that's suffering. Social disease, the destruction of the feudalistic system and traditionalism. But there's a little twist. Through the suffering, the weak can become the strong. That's the twist we see here. Not sure we'll see that same twist in Africa tomorrow. So where are we headed next? We're going to look at Africa and India. Next week we'll study India by watching the movie Gandhi. And then we come back and look at the Industrial Revolution and ideologies in chapter 5 and 6, and to some extent 8. And then we're done this unit. Enjoy your lunch.